Bueno, bienvenidos. Welcome to this. Thank you for being with us at this session approaching the cocktail hour. But it is an exciting topic that will keep us going. This is the presidential panel. I'm very happy to welcome you all to the presidential panel, Discipline and Publish, Activism in the 21st Century University. As its title suggests, this panel will explore the challenges and opportunities of academic activism, both in the context of historic hemispheric struggles and today's current political climate. Before we begin, on behalf of the Planning Committee, I'm Emily McGuire, one of the planning co-chairs, together with Javier Guerrero, the president of LASA for this year, Paola Cortes Roca, and Cecilia Fajardo Gil. I'd like to thank the Princeton Program in Latin American Studies, whose support helped make this session possible. Here in the panel, I have the pleasure of being joined by Loria Garcia Peña of Princeton University, Ricardo Dominguez from the University of California, San Diego, Jairo Funes Flores from Texas Tech, and Marcos Y. Perez from Washington and Lee University. And Marcos will be serving as today's moderator of our conversation here, so I'm going to extend a warm welcome to all of them and hand it off to Marcos.
Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. We have great presenters here. We already know who they are, so I don't even need to do that. Thank you. The format will be the following. I will ask some general questions to the participants, who will give some brief answers, 3 to 5 minutes. After that, we will open the floor to comments from the audience. I look forward to this important debate, both from the people who are here present and for the people who could not join us in person but who are online. I ask everyone to please keep comments and questions brief and respectful. Okay, this is a very, very important and timely topic, and we all have different opinions, so it is essential that we have a civil and insightful conversation. And I want to thank Emily, who is over there. I cannot see you because of the lights. I can't see anything. I feel like Borges must have felt, for organizing this panel. Without further ado, here is the first question. What is the role of the activist, academic, intellectual, in this context, whether in the United States or elsewhere?
Hopefully everyone can hear me. Thank you, Emily and Marcos, for the introduction. I guess I'll go first. So I want to begin my intervention or my response to this question with 2 quotes that perhaps get at the heart of this question. And I want to start with Rabia Egbaria, who's a Harvard law student who tried to publish a piece on the ongoing Nakba. Of course, Harvard Law Review refused to publish his work after he was already in the process of making revisions and so on. And he states in this piece that scholars tend to sharpen their pens after the smell of death has dissipated and moral clarity is no longer urgent. Edward Said, also 3 decades ago, said something similar along the lines of, in a critique of academics. He says that nothing is more reprehensible than those habits of mind in the intellectual that induce avoidance, that characteristic turning away from a difficult and principled position that you know to be the right one, but which you decide not to take. And of course, he was referring to Palestine. For me, these 2 quotes show the cowardice that we've seen of academics, and unfortunately and sadly, those who self-proclaim themselves to be critical, radical, and even those who, the school of thought that I admire, even some decolonial scholars. These academics have in reality formed part of the broker intellectual class who, with their nuanced takes or their positions of the so-called complexities of what's happening in Palestine, in fact, give license to Israel's Zionist colonial project of death and destruction. The intellectual, as Edward Said also reminded us, always has a choice. The choice, and perhaps the right choice, would be to side with the less represented, the weaker, the oppressed, the dominated, the forgotten, the systematically silenced. And we have a long tradition in Latin America, Rabbi Ayala, with the philosophy of liberation, with the theology of liberation, the preferential option of the poor. So we could also refer to those intellectual genealogies. The other option is to side with the more powerful, or to remain silent when speaking up is most urgent. This also resonates with the Palestinian educator and intellectual who Israel decided to kill, Bassel al-Araj, who also said, if you're not willing to be politically engaged, if you're not willing to confront domination and oppression, then our roles as intellectuals is pointless. The intellectual, and this is one of the things that I've learned most, one of the things from Rita Segato when writing about Aníbal Quijano, that the intellectual is like an antenna who is a sort of receptor of the socio-political context, the sites of struggle that create the conditions to think and do otherwise. So as intellectuals, we must speak and write with urgency in times of genocide, because in fact, what other ways can we actually speak and write during these times? And that would be my response to the first question. Thank you.
Yes, gracias. I guess one of the elements that's somewhat different in sort of the matrix of action that I think is important, that not so much the intellectual or the academic. And so what I will say within the university is that often academically we are allowed to point to the problem, capture the data. We're also allowed to perhaps publish to some degree after the fact the numbers that have been killed, why they have been killed. But the real question is what to do about it during the period of time that something of a catastrophe is occurring. And at least my experience as an artist at UC San Diego is that the universities are willing to allow the sort of indexing of the problem. They allow a sort of mapping of the problem, but if you go give them water, then that's where the academic research comes to an end. You can point to it, you can map it, but you cannot do anything directly about it. So for instance, in a project that I worked with, Electronic Disturbance 2.0, was the transporter immigrant tool that was about helping immigrants and refugees crossing the US-Mexico border to find water, to find safety and support by the communities there in Southern California. But the university and Congress and others basically said this is an act of traitor to the nation, if you will, if you go and give them water, if you point them in the right direction. So I think one of the crucial aspects of the intellectual project or the academic project is to push as much as we can, not only to intellectually understand, not only to gather the atomic facts of a catastrophe, but to do the kind of direct action, to have theory hit the ground. And I think that's where the conditions of danger and impossibility certainly seem to be shrinking at this particular moment. And so how do we navigate that? How do we express that? And how do we mobilize having theory hit the ground? in a very concrete way. And I think that's where the zone of danger is at this moment. It certainly has been in the past, but it's certainly very clear and foregrounded now. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. Do we have Lorcia? Oh, there.
I'm here. I think there might be something going on with the Zoom, but hopefully you can all hear me.
All right. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Emily, for inviting me to be part of this conversation. I'm sorry that I cannot be there in the flesh. I really wish I could. And it's just really great to be in conversation with two people whose work I've admired for quite some time, Ricardo and Jairo. So, muchas gracias por estar en conversación conmigo. I think I want to clarify that I do not believe every scholar needs to be an activist, at least not in the way in which we think about the word activism, which we tend to put this great weight in and bias, if you will, in terms of what it means. But I do think that those of us who are facing students and who are writing for the public have a moral responsibility to uphold the very basic fundamentals of humanity and to do no harm. So that is, as teachers and scholars, we are responsible for teaching and writing in a way that does not cause more harm, that does not sustain or perpetuate more inequalities, that does not erase the realities, histories, experiences of the most vulnerable. And that to me is the bare minimum. Beyond that, then if you're inclined, and I have to say that I feel very confused by people who are not inclined, given the political moment we're living in the world, not just in the United States, amidst genocide of Palestinian people, the massacre in Tigray, the horrors in Sudan and Kenya, what's happening in Haiti, the massive deportations, the disappearance of people, the human rights violations, the ongoing dictatorships, and the other atrocities. There's just so much going on in the world right now. So if you're a scholar and you're not inclined to do something about it, I don't like you. Beyond that, if you do feel inclined to do more, you should, because you can, because you have the knowledge and because you have the platform. It's a privilege to do the work that we do. And I do not think that I do think that we as scholars in this moment occupied an important role in our society. And Ida was talking earlier about our tradition as people of Latin American descent, and the kinds of how central debate and public opinion and the influence of intellectuals and scholars have always been in our key moments in history and in our society. For better or worse, we even had scholars and intellectuals that became presidents. So with the advent of social media and non-traditional media, where there really hasn't been an easier time to have access to public opinion and to be a voice of dissent. So I do think it is critical that in this moment in which academic institutions are under attack, not only in the United States again, but everywhere, via politics, via defunding, it's key that we assume this role if we haven't, that we remain vocal or become so if we haven't, that we continue to spread the word and make room for the work that is transformative, that is needed. But most importantly, that we do speak, and when we do write for the public, we do so in ways that reach them, that stay clear of academic jargon, and that actually serves the purpose of liberation. Is that we do our best to democratize knowledge outside of the classroom. And that when we teach, if we do teach, if we have the privilege of teaching others, that we do so for freedom, that we teach our students the tools of liberation. To me, that is our role in this moment. To me, if we're not actively doing this kind of work, no matter at what scale, we're otherwise complicit with the systems that are seeking to destroy the majority of us.
Thank you very much, and thanks to the three commentators, because you stayed within time, which is something that doesn't happen very frequently. And in particular, Lhasa, being full of Latin Americans and our interesting concept of time. That's very good. For the second question, what did last spring and subsequent events make clear about the current state of activism on and related to college campuses?
That's a great question. For me, the student-led Gaza Solidarity encampments in the US and in Europe unveiled in many ways the political limitations of this usual activist work, this very superficial activist work where it could be reduced to just symbolic gestures. It was students, in fact, who made more visible the importance of going beyond institutional reform, and especially pointing to the ways that institutional reform can also serve this sort of counterinsurgent effort of the institution, promising much but delivering very little. It was students who pointed to the ways in which universities, and this is one of the most important things, and of course many other people were doing this already, but students pointed to the ways in which the university is not only ideologically justifying domination, that in fact it is also an active participant in domination and genocide and dispossession. And I'll give you some more details hopefully in the subsequent questions that we have. And this is one of the things that they pointed to, was that the university has direct links with the creation, the production of technologies of violence, weapon manufacturing companies. And these links that the students pointed to, these material links, and these companies that the university has links with are Elbit systems, weapons that are tested, quote-unquote battle tested on Palestinians that are then exported around the world, and I'll give you some more details later of how that has unfolded. It was students who risked their careers while so many professors, unfortunately, watched as they got arrested, beaten, and most recently deported as well. It was students who put everything on the line for a dehumanized people. They've been told for a very long time that they were not worthy of solidarity. Students who were engaged in this work were trying to delink the university not only from the symbolic or epistemic investments that the university has, but the material project, the material investments in the things that I have just mentioned, the technologies of colonial violence. The students also sought to dismantle the colonial and capitalist foundations, not solely as a discursive task, and I think this is a critique that we could make, that the most critical traditions, including decolonial thought, has done an incredible job at critically examining the colonial foundations of the humanities, of the social sciences. But I think we probably need to do more to point to the technologies of colonial violence that the universities produce, to be able to pinpoint, to be able to say, these are the links and I want to sever or work against those, or at least sabotage those links. Certainly, knowledge underpins, or the logics of coloniality underpins the productions of these technologies of violence. But it is nonetheless important to shed light on these material dimensions of the university. And I think it is insufficient to only reduce the radical work that we want to do to textual analyses, to the critique or a discursive critique, but also making the connections to how these discourses become very real, very concrete, especially for those on the receiving end of dispossession, of genocide, of colonial domination.
Oh, yeah, I concur with all of the above. I think what's important also is that this is not an instance of the encampments and the actions of direct action and critique of the institution and the wider arenas around that institution, that there is a deep history. We can look back to the Cold War University, and there we had the Vietnam protest, Third World Solidarities, and then we can begin to see also, say in the 80s, the Central American wars, apartheid, often led by the students, and they carried with them the critical analysis that was afforded by the academic process. Then I would say for me what was important in training was ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, here in San Francisco in the 80s, where there was a lot of queer actions dealing with HIV, but also protesting immigrants being put in Guantanamo Bay, trying to stop the Central American wars. So there was already this kind of transnational organization during the Cold War university period. When I entered the university after examining with the Zapatistas in Chiapas in '94 methods of electronic civil disobedience against Mexico, US, and other elements, I came into the university because of those direct action. But at that moment, the university moved away from the Cold War valiancy or the neoliberal university to the War on Terrorism university post 9/11. So at UCSD, for instance, we investigated the way unmanned aerial vehicles were there at Drone Valley, our university working with General Atomics, were instantiating the kind of technologies that are being tested in Palestine, in Ukraine, and are the product of this, what we would call the War on Terrorism University. The other element that I think is important, and I echo you, that the students took on this zone of conversation, and what amplified for me that the students were doing was allowing us to understand that the university is still a center of conflict and power and resistance to such a degree that the nation state felt it needed to militarize the zone. So the university is still a zone where some public critical discourse can happen, and the students were at the forefront of that particular moment. At this particular moment, I think we're seeing maybe Trump University and what Trump University is doing in terms of dismantling various categories of knowledge production and student organizations, if you will. But I think all those layers of the history of battles of the Cold War University, the neoliberal university, the War on Terrorism University, and now Trump University, at the core is this matrix of academic knowledge, intellectual discourse, and the way that students manifested that during the encampments, I think, was really important.
Thank you very much. Logia?
Yep. So I love this question because I've been saying now for a year that what I garnered from last spring, both the incredible experience that was being part of encampment and the heartache and hardness that was to watch a university called Cops and our students fire contingent faculty, put us all at harm. I mean, what I garnered from all of that was precisely a lot of clarity. And I think, you both spoken to this clarity and also to the trajectory. I appreciated Ricardo's reminder of, this didn't happen in an empty vacuum, right? Like this was in the work. This is how students have been responding to the colonizing white supremacist industry that is the university. But I think there were three things that became clear to perhaps those who have the privilege of existing in a universe in which things are not often clear. People who transit in privilege in different ways than I do, for example. One, that student organizing is effective. And Jairo talked about that at length at the beginning. And it has always been effective. And it's in fact so effective that universities are scared shitless of what the students can actually do and accomplish if we actually allow them to. Two, that the university is indeed a colonizing white supremacist capitalist industry that cares more about their endowments and their investments in other things such as sports than they do about the well-being of students and about the actual learning and creation of communities that are for justice and for liberation. And three, that the fields of knowledge that have been always under attack, ethnic studies, women, gender, and sexuality studies, any anti-colonial field, are under attack precisely, have always been underfunded and under attacked, and never have come from the actual university, but from students' movement, the same organizing that we've been speaking about that is effective. That these fields are once again made as scapegoats of all of the university's policies in retaliation of last spring's movement. So we're seeing a disproportionate number of African American studies majors being targeted, for example, not being allowed to walk in graduation, being persecuted, same with faculty, and so on. So we have gotten a lot of clarity of what the university is, what the university has been, and what its role is in this sort of challenging status quo. And for me, that clarity is important because it asks of us certain questions. Are we going to continue to be invested in an institution that is so intent on killing us? And if not, then what's next? Where do we move from here? How do we continue to make knowledge and disseminate knowledge in a way that is safe for all of us? And how do we move? How do we teach classes as most of us who are in this room, Latin American or Latino studies scholars, when our very students are being targeted for deportation and abduction on our very campuses? How do we actually respond to that on a practical level beyond these kinds of conversations and beyond what we want to publish or how we want to teach? What do you do if ICE shows up to your classroom? That's a question that I'm interested in people in this room answering.
Thank you very much. So the third question, how might we connect what's happening in the United States vis-a-vis academic activism to broader stories of struggle across the Americas, not just the United States?
It's a big question. So hopefully I'll stick to the 3 to 5 minutes. If not, I'll relinquish my time for the next question. I'm okay with that. One of the first things that I want to say is that the activist work or the movement, the student-led movement that we've seen here is deeply and historically entangled with the struggles of Abya Yala or Latin America, but also around the world. And there's a reason why when you hear the chants, no one is free until Palestine is free, it might sound cliche, but in fact, it really is not. And I want to point to some of these things. When the U.S. in the past, and Ricardo already mentioned a few of these things, when anti-war protests were too strong, or where international pressure was too high, U.S. Congress has passed arms embargoes on regimes that, in fact, the U.S. government had supported and imposed through coups, and we know the histories in Latin America. There's plenty of that. So when the U.S. couldn't overtly support a specific regime, it was, in fact, Israel through the production of these technologies that I had mentioned already, these technologies of violence that the U.S. and Israel manufactured in collaboration with one another, but where the university was at the heart of this production in the assistance of creating these weapons. So technologies of colonial violence can range from surveillance, military weapons, counterinsurgency, military training, torture, to population control through reservations, open-air prisons, or quote-unquote, as we're seeing in Gaza, concentration camps, ethnic cleansing, which is euphemistically misportrayed as relocation. These technologies of violence have historically been used to repress social movements and liberation movements, indigenous movements in Latin America. We should think of this in some ways as two sides of the same coin, where student activists, in fact, and the faculty and staff that aligned themselves with this struggle, this recent struggle, is more, it's targeting the production of these weapons when the movements and liberation struggles in Latin America have been on the receiving end of specific regimes that apply these same technologies that are imported from Israel and from the US. So there is this transnational flow of sorts of these technologies. And I want to give you a few examples, which Raul Civeche also pointed to yesterday in a presentation. But the first one we could trace it back to the Dominican Republic under the regime of Trujillo, where Israel sent weapons. Same thing can be said about Haiti under Jean-Claude Duvalier, where Uzi machine guns and armored vehicles were sent, and all in exchange for the support in the United Nations to legitimate Israel's occupation, right? So Israel does have some vested interest, but at the same time, it's defending the geopolitical and imperial designs of the U.S. In Central America, we could think about Guatemala, the genocide there, through the exportation of military personnel, training, weapons, and so on, where we saw indigenous and campesino communities, the razing of villages, hundreds of thousands of people killed, a number said 100,000 women raped, and so on. That parallels the things that we're seeing in Gaza and El Salvador. 83% of the military imports came from Israel. Nicaragua, the same thing, 98%. And I could keep on going, but it would probably last several hours or perhaps many days to list all of these countries wherever there was a regime imposed by the US or there were certain interests. Rest assured that Israel was there to also defend those interests and to have some exchange there to give it legitimacy in terms of its settler colonial project.
Thank you. One of the elements of the kind of long list of global violence that the U.S. and Israel and other empires that have networked over the decades is that I think what's important is also to see the way transnationally communities of contestation, resistance, and creativity have emerged. And I think, for instance, the Zapatistas in '94 in Chiapas offered an intercontinental, intergalactic view of what was possible against these kind of global forces of technocratic violence. You have communities like those who are fighting at Black Rock, the indigenous communities there. And there's a long history of tactical media and actions that artists have implemented that I think allow us to perhaps see moments that are not shut off automatically by the violence of a global system of empires. Because once you start listing that, then it just becomes let the dead bury the dead via these economies. So I think the encampments, manifested to me this kind of internationalization of potential, of contestation and resistance. And as always, it can be overpowered, it can be shut down by militarized university, but nonetheless, I think there is a quality that resides in the capacity of imagining, as we would say at UCSD, that another university is possible. And while we may not be able to have the sort of level of global technological force, we as a community do have access to all sorts of, and for me at least, fascinating technologies that allow the exchange of information, the exchange of the facts on the ground, the exchange of atomic facts that allow us to map out potentials for critique, contestation, and imagining that another possibility can occur within institutions because we're constantly being hit by an infodemic of critique, pessimism, and nihilism. Doesn't mean that we have to be overly positive and happy-faced, But I think there is a sense that our communities and the students are creating and inventing other vocabularies, other practices that are transnational. For instance, when often we were brought in by Congress or the police for electronic civil disobedience against the Mexican government or the Pentagon or others during the 90s, they would say, you know, who is the ideological kingpins behind this? And we would say the Zapatistas. And then they would say, how do you get messages? And we would say, they are messages from the future. The Zapatistas have clearly already achieved another level of reality, and so they send us these messages of potentiality, of Mayan technologies, we would say. And so this made it difficult for the authorities to arrest us. And while certainly the encampments were shut down, I think there are potentials of messages of the future that hit the ground in what they were doing, and that we can certainly imagine otherwise into the days that come, even if they hit us with the endless list of weapons and eliminations of communities that we have faced over decades or centuries now. Thank you.
Georgia, please.
Thank you, Ricardo, for that reminder of that invitation to imagine and reimagine. Last year, I read Ruha Benjamin's beautiful book, Imagination. And, you know, if we just remember that all the horrible things that are happening in the world right now came out of someone's awful head. And in the same way, we can reimagine a different way, a different world, a different possibility for ourselves. To answer the question, I don't see what is happening in the United States in terms of activism and in terms of also the political moment that we're living in as separate from what is happening in Latin America or in the rest of the world for that matter. Take my native Dominican Republic, for example. The Dominican state has been engaging in a practice of violent abduction and deportation of Haitian people for quite some time now. And the kinds of technologies of surveillance in the border are still idle coming from Israel. So some of the people who are being targeted and deported were born in Dominican soil, were never immigrants. But this persecution of Haitian people in my native country also serves a populist tactic that diverts public attention from government corruption and other issues to the quote-unquote immigrant problems. It's always been a tactic, and it continues to be a tactic. And the effects are, of course, the same kinds of also persecution of scholarship, of artists, of people who are perceived as different or dissident. And we continue to see how what is happening in the United States is being happening in Latin America, it's been happening in Central America, it's been happening anywhere that there is a border. And we're just seeing it being in many ways magnified and not really thinking about it together. Because in the United States, as scholars of the United States or operating within the United States, we tend to be hyper-focused on what is happening here and not really thinking across in a way that is productive for solidarity movement. And you know, for better or worse, the thing about working within the belly of the beast is that, as so many of us is that we know the monster from inside, and we know, and that knowledge is critical for fighting against the destruction that we're all facing due to this capitalismo sin freno. And so for those of us who are from the Caribbean, for example, this vaivén between the United States and the Caribbean has and is and continue to be a constant. It is, even if you never migrated, the coming and going of ideas, people and goods that have been facilitated by US colonialism in the Caribbean is so integral to our existence that it would be otherwise fake to think of another way. We are constantly entrenched, if you will, with the United States. But what we do lack I think that as scholars thinking across is parity. There's still so many hierarchies of knowledge and information, and in what circulates based precisely on the fact that the United States is an empire. And as such, its production of knowledge dominates how we learn and teach across the globe. We're speaking in English in this panel, so the politics of translation and language that continues to dominate academic research is also a challenge. And I think there are some really basic, important ways in which we can connect more by simply ensuring that the work we produce in English, for example, with scholars based in the United States, circulates in Spanish, Portuguese, Creole, or any other indigenous language you have access to back home, and that we make efforts to translate not only semantically and linguistically, but in political ways, the work that we're doing here, and that we can create platforms of engagement with our colleagues who are in Latin America by teaching their work, by translating their work, by creating spaces of collaboration.
Thank you very much once again, and we're going to have the final question before we open for questions, comments, debate from the audience. What kinds of historical considerations do we need to keep in mind in thinking about activism hemispherically? What kinds of insights might we gain from a comparative perspective?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. This is coincidentally my dissertation research, which feels like well, not that long ago. I finished it 5 years ago. So coincidentally, my research focused on activist work. It was an ethnographic study that I worked alongside with the student movement in Honduras. So I learned a few things about student movements, student activism in Latin America. And that points to this sort of hemispheric, transnational movement of student movements in this case. Ricardo already mentioned the Third World Liberation Front, or Third World Solidarities. We could look at it from the 1960s. Here in San Francisco, in fact, San Francisco State, and then Berkeley, that's where the Third World Liberation Front emerges, where is a coalition of Chicano, indigenous, Black, Asian students, organizations who come together in solidarity with the liberation and decolonization, anti-colonial movements around the world, but also a movement to restructure knowledge production in the U.S. We could go back further just to think about the movements in Latin America in 1918, con el Manifiesto Liminar de Córdoba in 1918. We start seeing the push to restructure also the colonial foundations, not only of knowledge, but also of the governance structure and the nation-state building links that the university had. So we start seeing also the push throughout Latin America after 1918 to defend the autonomy of or to even create the autonomy of the university, and the radical democratization of the university, which I think the core principles are still there, and that's why I believe that the universities in Latin America have had this radical or political ontology, if you will, because of student movements, because students in the past, for the past over 100 years, have been doing that. But if we want to add a comparative lens, when thinking about, specifically, I want to refer to student movements, I believe that in the US, the student activist work that happened in the 60s probably was ahead in terms of a strong critique of the Eurocentric knowledge production, of trying to push the university to create some other programs, to restructure the university to create a third world college. That was actually the initial project, which became reduced to ethnic studies. But in any case, in Latin America, what we do see is that student movements are more than student movements, are more than trying to reform the university. In fact, many of the revolutions, estallidos sociales in Chile and Colombia, we see all of these movements, social movements, broad-based social movements that are in fact led by students. So this is one of the things that we probably want to consider, and if we wanted to compare, is that student movements are not necessarily only that. They're much more. And this is one of the things that perhaps we want to think about is how do we learn from one another, the strategies, the organizing, the links that we need to find. Like Latin America, there's strong organizations. OCLAI, for instance, students meet together in Cuba, or in the U.S. It's very loose structure. How do we learn from Latin American organizing and strategies and tactics as well to strengthen the movement that is being systematically repressed here?
No, I think that's a really important history to be aware of in terms of the global organizations of student movements historically. I guess for me, because I'm focused on technology, and I like technology a great deal and I'm involved with it, is so to compare, say, the question of the US-Mexico border historically in terms of technology and compare it. So let us say in the 1960s, you had the development of the electronic fence between North Vietnam and South Vietnam, called the McNamara line, working with IBM and sensors that completely failed to keep the North Vietnamese out of South Vietnam, even though they had unmanned aerial vehicles and what have you. What the North Vietnamese did is they understood that there was chemical sensors on this McNamara line, so they would take buckets of piss and put them next to the sensors, and IBM and the unmanned aerial vehicles would go hundreds of thousands of North Vietnamese here, and then they would bomb the buckets of piss, and the North Vietnamese would move the other way. That then was sold in the US right after the Vietnam War, that same McNamara line, the belief that an electronic virtual fence could be established for deep surveillance of immigrants and refugees, but it constantly failed. And now we have the implementation of a new technologically hot zone, right? You have Palantir, Anduril, AI-driven virtual fences, if you will. But again, I think if we compare the history of the way electronics, the digital, the obsession by the technocratic state to always anchor whatever new technology or language of technology is manifesting as the way to do surveillance, as a way to keep the outsider out of the nation state. But if we compare the histories of the way these systems have worked, technologically they have always failed. And so we often fall into the attunement of the way they're selling the technology, as if it were a given atomic fact, if you will. And what we do know more clearly than anything else comparatively in terms of the history of the use of technology in these kinds of wars of techno-violence is that more often than not, they fail to actually accomplish what ultimately they want to do. And so I think what's important on a global level is to share the way they glitch, the way they break down, and the inability of their marketing to fulfill their own desires in that market economy. And I think that's what we as an institution and as a global community can share. We can share where those breakdowns are, where their vision fails, if you will, and compare this long history, even if we're only looking at the US-Mexico border, as an instantiation of that inevitable failure of each system. And it might seem terrible at the time, but again, there's always a glitch, a failure, an inability to meet their own technocratic demands. And so I think that's important to share transnationally as well.
Go ahead, please.
Oh, yeah. When I think about the historical considerations that we need to keep in mind to think about activism hemispherically, which is the question at hand, without trying to really sound like a broken record, I think that if we want to work hemispherically, if we want to collaborate, there first need to be a more sustained critical dialogue and awareness about the colonizing role that the United States has had in Latin America and the impact that that role has had in how Latin Americans construct themselves, not only vis-a-vis the United States, but each other in relation to one another, in relation to Europe and Europeans, and in relation to different notions of race, language, and religion, which are mediated by US colonialism, not only by European colonialism. And so without that knowledge and the specificity of its impact in the region, I don't think there can be a dialogue. Without that knowledge, there will also continue to be ruptures in the way in which we build alliances across our communities, both back in Latin America, where people are still feeling the impact of US interventions of the 20th century, and in the United States, as Latin American immigrants and descendants, Latinos in the United States. And one very tangible example of the latter is the ways in which people were very surprised that how so many Latinos voted in the past elections. And it's like all these headlines the next day, oh my God, Latinos actually voted for Trump. And people are like, oh, we didn't know Latinos were racist. I'm like, no, shit. So many people were surprised about the numbers of Latinos, most of them from immigrant communities, who voted for Trump. And this surprise came from a profound historical misunderstanding of how Latin Americans have experienced things like dictatorships, US interventions, etc., and how these historical processes have affected their migration and the way in which they either understand or not American politics, are able to be manipulated by certain triggering languages, and the ways in which they perceive their role and their relationships with other marginalized communities in the United States. So I think for me, the first step in trying to create any kind of hemispheric alliance is to be able to have this very honest and uncomfortable conversations about US colonialism in Latin America, about the impact on how Latin American peoples experience race and migration and other kinds of isms to this moment, and how that has shaped bordering practices in Latin America, and how for so many of us who are US Latinos, that's a specter that we carry, and that shapes how we navigate both our experiences in Latin America and in the United States. So that's really where I think we need to start. And then, yes, all the historical experiences and all that we can gain from especially from the student movements that Jairo was mentioning earlier. In the Dominican Republic, for example, it was in the National University where the Civil War started against the US intervention in 1965. So this is a history, these are histories that we share and that there are a lot of people can learn from. But it isn't exactly our present. So I think we also need to think about what has changed in Latin America, that we're seeing every day more of the extreme right rising, more of these ultra-conservative groups, even within our universities, also rising. So what shifted and what is happening now that wasn't happening in the 60s? How and when did the Latin American University become what it is now? And it's no longer this sort of bastion of freedom and liberation that it used to be. So I would also be questioning and wondering what's happening at this moment and at this juncture.
Thank you very much. Well, the panel is called Discipline and Publish, and thanks to the self-discipline of the commentators, we now have a substantial amount of time for comments and questions and ideas from the audience, and I'm going to moderate that. Just 1 second. Do we have, so you're keeping track of comments from Zoom, so probably we'll do one in person, one from Zoom. Okay. Okay, perfect. Take it away, please.
I'll take the mic because if not, the people on
Zoom won't hear it.
Thank you. Apologies for raising my hand because I have to go to a publication presentation where I'm part of. Thank you so much for this discussion. I think it's important and urgent to have. One of my worries is that, you know, even when we look back at the student movements in Colombia or Chile, let's say the 1980s, or even recently in the recent protests, there has been an enormous amount of loss of life and violence, loss of eyes, loss of limbs, loss of this. So, and when we talk about students that are being deported and students that are being, you know, removed from actually getting their degrees, or professors that don't have tenure that actually get chucked out. So it's not that easy, is it? So in the sense as wherever model you look, there is violence and there is an enormous amount of, that's why the issue of discipline and punish, it's real. Losing your job, losing your degree, you know, being deported back to Iraq or something like that, it's literally the loss of life. So, you know, no matter how much I want to even encourage my students to be protesting or whatever, I'm reluctant. How do we teach them to look after themselves while they actually manage to organize themselves? I don't want any of my students to lose their eyes, to lose their visa, to lose anything, and I don't want my faculty associates to lose their jobs. So there is something that we need to moderate here, which is let's protest, but let's not become victims of the protest.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's something to consider. Given the theme as well of this talk, discipline and punish, I usually don't share, even if my talk is related to just personal experience. For instance, last year I was also suspended from my university for these kind of talks, for the public intellectual work that Lorgia was referring to, this public-facing sort of work, whether it's through social media, whether it's through founding a Faculty for Justice in Palestine chapter, whether it's working with Students for Justice in Palestine. Well, those things do have consequences, and that is definitely true. And we don't want to do things in such a way where we put people more at risk than there already are. That's why we've had media trainings, security, cybersecurity, why we should use certain type of emails, Proton, for instance, Signal, what do you need to do when you travel, and all of these things, right? So there's this sort of network that has been created since then to try to at least minimize those risks. You know, it isn't easy. After my suspension, which is, it lasted 40 days, of course, with all of that, there's health issues involved. Last fall, for whatever reason, even though I feel like I eat well and exercise, I had a stent put in my right coronary artery. For whatever reason it was, whether it was loss of sleep, whether it was the stress of being suspended, but my right coronary artery was 99% blocked, and the doctors were asking me if I had a stressful year of sorts. I said, I think you could say that. So, yeah, it is. We have to take care of ourselves because el camino es largo, no? And so we have to really focus on that, but at times it is hard. It's easy to push it away, to say, no, I'm okay, I'm strong enough, but in fact, we're not. And so we do have to be careful. We have to protect our colleagues, our students, but if we do see it, if we do see the disciplining and the punishing, we probably have to do something, right? In my department, when this happened to me, unfortunately, no one said anything. So this is where you feel isolated, but you have to build community outside if you don't have it there, and build a network, organize, and work, but also take care of yourself at the same time.
If I could, what Heido was saying, and to the question, I started my intervention today by saying that we should be very clear that not everyone needs to be an activist, and I really do believe that. And I actually often discourage students who are at risk, undocumented students, from doing things that I think are going to put them at harm. And I think everyone on this roundtable has suffered, the serious consequences of the university disciplining us. I was denied tenure. That's nobody's, secret. And like Heido, I've been dealing with, health issues since, because the stress of doing this kind of work is real. It's getting, death threats every day, people showing up at your personal homes and putting families at risk. So I think, before putting yourself in the public eye, you have to be very, very sure that you know what the risks are, and that you're willing to take those risks. But having said that, there are things that you can do on a daily basis to protect your students, to teach your students tools, so that if they choose to do so, not that you're going to go and request that your students become activists and go protesting. I don't think that is a responsible way to conduct yourself in the classroom, but it is also equally irresponsible to be in this political climate in which we are under attack for our mere existence, to not even provide the tools and the knowledge that students need to protect themselves. I think we do have that responsibility. And for those of us who are tenured, we need to be the ones putting ourselves on the line for faculty who are on tenure. And for those of you who are white and rich, you should be stepping up first. So I think we all need to be very aware of what our privileges are within the institutions in which we teach. And those who are most protected need to be the ones stepping up and protecting the least protected of us. And that means our students, but that also means on tenure faculty. And I did not see much of that. I haven't seen much of that. What I've seen is the opposite. I've seen a lot of vulnerable faculty, folks who are postdocs, who are lecturers, who are untenured, who are of color and queer, are the ones who are there on the line every day. And the folks who are the most protected, who have the most protection from the institution because of who they are and how they move in the world, tend to not be stepping up. And I think we really need to talk about this, and we need to talk about it openly, because we are in a situation in which many people are at risk. And it is not an unfair question to ask of all of us here who are in the classroom, what are you going to do if ICE shows up to your classroom and demands one of your students? What is going to be your response? How are you going to protect that person? Are you willing to put your job on the line? Because it might come to that. And so those are really hard and difficult questions that I think all of us should be asking us of ourselves at this moment.
Well, I think I come at it at a different angle, in that I was already doing artivist or activist work in the 80s and 90s, and dealing with Congress and Pentagon, all sorts of entities who are not happy with artivism, if you will. And so it was a very cowboy-like attitude, right? Because I was an artist, I was autonomous, so I didn't really have to worry, because it was just part of my art practice. But once I was hired to be a teacher at a university, I really wasn't aware of the hierarchies of fragility that were around me. So I trained the students to do electronic civil disobedience, and we took down the University of California Office of the President. We did all sorts of actions that then the university tried to detenure me the year after they gave me tenure for doing the very same things that I was doing the year after, right? They gave me tenure for electronic civil disobedience, hacktivism, nanotechnology work, what have you. So I had to really come to understand the fragility of undergraduates, graduate students. I didn't know exactly about tenure and non-tenured faculty until I entered the university. So sort of that sensibility of the autonomous cowboy had to really shift to understand what everybody else is facing. And at this particular time, you hear stories of young faculty who are, immigrants here in the U.S., queer faculty, faculty of color, who are under hyper duress and become physically ill. And I think that's something that I had to learn, even going through the detenuring process and that particular kind of battle. And so I think I am trying to be much more nuanced in understanding what artivism is. But at the same time, I think it's important that we look at moments of, again, technological actions, for instance, indigenous AI, black AI, student-driven AI systems that they're trying to tell us, is terrible, what have you. And so I do think that we have to make sure that students feel that they can hit the ground in their activism, that they can use new technologies, that they can have some social force field, which to me is often the social force field of electronic research, right? So that tends to be a key category. So I had to learn the hard way about the fragility of the way the institution constitutes students, graduate students, and untenured faculty. So I'm a little bit more nuanced now, and I try to rein in the cowboy attitude, and my family certainly helps me understand that.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Zoom. We have actually many questions. We had to pick one. And actually, I'm going to edit it down a little bit. So as educators, how do you propose to deal with apathy in the classroom? In other words, this feeling that students tend to have that they're very pessimistic and that nothing will really change.
Well, I have great fun. One of the ways that I teach, and I think pedagogy is key right now. If there's any social force field, it's pedagogy. And so I often teach classes that I call Trojan horses. So for instance, I teach undead media, all things zombie. And so suddenly students have to think about Gothic Marx. They have to read volume 1 of Marx on vampires and monsters. They have to learn about the Haitian Revolution, the occupation of the U.S. of Haiti. They have to learn that White Zombie was about labor and the horror of the white plantation owner. And they can read Marx. They can read all these things critically as long as the zombies say that's what the case is. If I were to teach a class saying, we're going to read dialectical materialism from, 1850 to here, they would leave. But here, the undead media, they're willing to deep dive into all sorts of things that I think in other places, the language we use, right? What are queer zombies? What are, what have you? And they're more than willing to look at the dialectic there. Another class that I teach is Extinction by Design. So I have speculative media classes where we look at the way the Anthropocene has been created and that we are designing it, our own extinction. Now, while they might not want to read about geology, they might not want to read about, extractivism, but suddenly they're thinking about extinction by design. And suddenly the term design becomes a way, the burrito I call it, right? That you can stuff it with deep content, but because it has this kind of Trojan horse element, they can become critical, activists in their own sensibility. So I think pedagogy is the thing that we have right now. And I think not everybody can do indirect kind of things. But I think students are very knowledgeable, they're very critical, and they're willing to talk about what's happening in Palestine because they get to watch World War Z, right, where the zombies climb over the walls of Israel. So suddenly they're able to enter into a vocabulary in a class that might not be critically as available in another sort of presentation and pedagogy. So I think maybe that answers.
Please go ahead.
I teach PhD students only, so their engagement with the readings are a little bit higher, let's say. I did teach 2 years, I think I taught undergrads. And yeah, it was, if we could compare at least my experience, I did notice some difference there. But for me, I do have a lot of international students. And what always surprises me is, well, we see the colonial foundations of all educational institutions for one, but is that they come to my courses and, you know, I tend to assign or shift the readings that may align to the scholars that they themselves are unfamiliar with. Scholars, anti-colonial thinkers from Uganda, Kenya, and I always find it really interesting, right? In the sense that they come to the U.S. To my course specifically to then read scholars that were denied to them systematically. And so this is one of the ways that I try to make the connections across of what has happened and what was denied to them before and what's continuing to be, or what's denied today. And then at the same time, making connections across geographies, across histories, and making direct connections, at least the apathy in terms not only with the engagement of the content, but also the political apathy that characterizes academia in the sense of the competitive aspect, the possessive individualist kind of subjectivity that academia is designed to create and reproduce. And I agree with Ricardo, the pedagogy is key. So it's not only being inclusive of different readings, but what type of pedagogical aspect or dimensions and discussions, what kind of teacher and educator are you to students, right? And so this is one of the key aspects of that relationship between the curriculum, but also the pedagogical aspect. Just being inclusive and adding one reading or two to the syllabus is insufficient, right? So I completely agree, Ricardo.
The question to Vic here. I think, well, a couple of things that come to mind. The population that you're teaching, it makes a difference. So there, I teach in an Ivy League university where students are very immersed in their classes and have a lot of support and a lot of privilege. But in other times when I've taught in public universities, students have 3 jobs and very difficult situations at home, it's really, really hard for them to make commitments to any kind of activism because of fear or because of time. So being really aware of the student population, I think, is really important as you're talking to them. When it comes to the sort of the apathy for the subject, always go back to art. Students respond always to visual art, to movies, to paintings, to poetry, to things that are contemporary, to artists that are of this moment. I find that when my students are not really connecting, it's typically my problem. There's something that I'm doing wrong, and I just sort of go back to the drawing board. I'm a big fan of doing mid-semester evaluations, asking students, okay, what would you want to see more of? Where am I messing up here? How am I not connecting with you? Because we have to remember that every 4 years we get a new generation of students, and they have different ways of learning. And so I'm always constantly learning from my students. And I'm one of those scholars that actually really loves the classroom. I love teaching. I love teaching undergraduate students. I really enjoy it. But it does require a lot of humility and being able to reinvent yourself often to connect with the new generation of students. Pedagogy is key. How you teach, not only what you teach, but how. One of the exercises that I have my students do a lot in the classes is that they identify a silence or an omission in my syllabus.
And they love it, because what young person does not want to point out how you messed up? And so, they made this list of all the things that I missed in like my intro to, Latino studies or my Black Latinos class. And once they do that, what they don't know is that then the next task is they have to fill that silence. They're going to have to figure out how to fill the silence in the syllabus. And they spend the whole semester working in groups doing that. So getting your students like really hyper invested in the program, in the class program, in the syllabus, getting them to think about the major problems in the world, in society through the micro. So I have them do a lot of work within like their dorms and their university. How do you find spaces for decolonizing within campus? And this kinds of exercises in which they are invested, in which they're working in groups. I don't do individual work in my classrooms. I stopped doing that. My grad students go crazy and have like an aneurysm every semester, because I'm like, you're not working by yourself. You are going to have to share the byline. And it's really important for me that we put into practice in the doing in the classroom the stuff that we're preaching. If we are actually trying to decolonize the classroom, we need to do it in the assignments as well, in the way we grade, and in the kinds of hierarchies that we often as teachers reproduce in the classroom. And that's really hard to do. It takes a lot of humility. It takes a lot of deep breathing and understanding how much you don't know. But at the end of the semester, it's always really beautiful to see how much we've all grown together and how the collective learning takes precedence. And when that takes precedence, everybody gains something out of it.
Thank you very much. Questions now from the audience in person.
Thank you so much for this. I want to thinking about what students can and younger folks can tell us, and I've been thinking, Ricardo, about your work with the Zapatistas, and mentioning the Zapatistas made me think of the massive sort of shift that was felt with the Primera Declaración de la Selva Lacandona, and the use of the internet, which at that moment was just, it was just taking off. It was not yet the monster it's become today. And I wonder if any of you in your activist work or your pedagogical work have had a sense of new things to come that can help us in either as activists ourselves or as teachers trying to give students some of the tools for both activism and self-care in the midst of that activism. Because it seems to me that this is a moment in which some of the strategies that we've learned historically are no longer functioning in the way that they used to, and that we're going to need to be creative. So I'm wondering, are there any things that we can sort of, vislumbrar, glimpse in the horizon that might help us, that might be changing?
Yeah, no, I think it's clear that we've gone through a shift digitally from the moment the Zapatistas emerged to this particular moment. I think what we can certainly, at least for me, have guidance from the students, say, in the encampment, is that it continues to be really vital that data bodies and real bodies be one. That is, we often divide them. Data bodies exist in a certain kind of territory. The real bodies exist in another. And I think the encampments presented the case where the data body and the real bodies could be together. That is present. And I think that's something that terrifies the university or other entities. One of the things that we dreamed of with the Digital Zapatista was that we could unite data bodies and real bodies gathering together. And I think the encampment, like Occupy movement before and others, are about a gathering and how does one manifest that gathering. often with technology, depending on what platforms or systems exist. And remember, those systems that we are bound by now, they're going to be gone. You know, I could probably go through a lineage in the last 10 years of all the technologies that seem to be there. But the core, I think, the performative matrix of those technologies, I think the key is instantiating embodiment, instantiating gathering, because it's there that I think it allows us then to begin to imagine other ways that aren't necessarily always bound to the technological code switch, because it's about sitting around in a group, sharing information that's lived, and then that little bit is shared with some other little group a little further on down. We could create all sorts of language for it, swarm bodies, or just hanging out with your friends. Back in the 80s, we called it fiestas críticas, right? Where we would all hang out, party, and share our reading, if you will. So I don't think we necessarily need to anchor changes or shifts on a planetary scale based on some platform or technology that will probably pass on, but the importance of having the students gather together by whatever means necessary, and I think that often triggers new knowledge, new sensibilities, and they certainly teach me in my classes about what they've been doing and how they've been able to accomplish it, and I think in fearless ways. So I don't know. What could the future bring? I'm not quite sure what the future will bring, but I do know that students often are our future, and they certainly bring it into the classroom, and they bring it into the everyday, even if it's in a fragile condition. And so I think it's important to learn that they are the platform, right? Those human beings are the platform of the future, whatever it might be, that we have to link to and listen to.
Yeah, this kind of makes me, make some connections between the previous question in terms of curriculum and pedagogy, but what we saw in the encampments was this other education, right? This other curriculum, the renaming of libraries, the creation of new libraries in the lawns, new pedagogy, teach-ins, and education otherwise, if you will. And one of the things that we do have to be careful of, given that we find ourselves in these spaces, are the archives that the university is creating. Because we know that the university will one day value and sell and commodify these movements, just as the UC system commodifies the 1960s and has murals, when in fact, in the 1960s, it was a university repressing the student movement, just the way that the university is currently repressing the student movement and faculty and the other dissident voices. So what do? We have to create counter archives in the present through documentaries, through insurgent forms of writing, other sorts of media. And I think this is already being done, but our own contributions, if we have the resources, also contribute to the creation of these counter archives, because once again, the distortion of what's happening today will be seen, whether it's 10 or 15 or 20 or more years, where resistance and collective action will be valued as long as it can be commodified.
You know me a little bit, so I'm a super practical person, so I'm going to go with some tangible stuff that I think can be helpful in the classroom, if I understand your question about like how to teach in this moment, right? And what are some things that can be helpful? And I think we all can get training in the technologies, and I think integrating new technologies is always really helpful. And I think Heider's suggestion of archiving, I think it's critical at this moment. A lot of our students are doing it already, and if we can integrate. I, for example, teach a class on archiving, and students are really taken by it because they get to create their own archives. But I think if there's one thing that can work across in the sciences, the social sciences, and the humanities is an awareness of how the COVID-19 pandemic changed our kids' brains and the way in which they learn and the kinds of challenges that they have. And I think I often hear a lot of frustration from some of my colleagues about how students are presenting in the classroom, things like disengagement and all kinds of other troubles. And I think finding ways in which we can support our students' learning with compassion, I think that is the most important thing that we can do right now in the classroom. I think a lot of our students, especially the undergrad students, are coming in the classroom with a lot of lack because of what the pandemic has done to them as younger kids in high school or in middle school. Some of the executive function tools that they did not get to learn, and we don't talk about that often, but yet we are all living through it in the classroom. So what are some of the ways in which we can be supportive? And I think doing more hands-on active learning is really helpful if you wanna get students engaged. Being able to think through different angles of assignments, finding multiple ways of teaching the same material. So if you are going to assign a very long critical article to a first year's students, are there alternatives that can also allow them to engage with the material, whether it is a film or an audiobook or any other form? So I think we need to be more cognizant about the limitations that some of our students are facing because of the challenging times that we're living. I think we also need to be aware that the last 15 years has seen the highest number of protests in this history of this country, and we're not really thinking about that, but it's actually how it's been. So this generation of students have grown up watching a lot of political duress and uncertainty, and they're afraid. And yes, they can be apathetic because why the fuck wouldn't you be? We're burning up the planet. We have a dictatorship in the United States. You are abducting people. Some people's parents are being deported to the wrong country that they're not from. The economy is shit. I mean, there is so much to be afraid of if you are 20 years old. So I think coming to the classroom with a lot of generosity and awareness of how it feels to them, I think it's really important, as we're also trying to teach them critical tools, as we're also trying to teach them the material that we're actually intending to teach in our classes. We cannot separate those two things. You cannot come into the classroom as a teacher to teach decolonial or Latin American history and not come in with the awareness that there's a lot of suffering and that they're carrying all of that into your classroom.
Well, thank you very much. We are out of time, but before we depart, I want to please ask for a round of applause for the speakers.